I'm going to try to be controversial nonetheless, even if I'm not doing the usual green growth versus degrowth dilemma. But I live and breathe of these topics. So if you want, we can talk about it at any day, any time of the day or any day. What I'm going to try to do here is something that I usually do instead when I'm talking to a group of economists, in the sense that it is my perception that a lot of people, let's say, are not in favor within the economics profession, not necessarily in favor of going down the degrowth route, but they would say, look, we don't know, maybe it has a bit of growth impact, maybe it doesn't. Our models don't necessarily show this growth impact. And so let's be between the agnostic to the fact that it is fine if it's neutral. And I'm going to take a different perspective. This is the narrative I was telling you about that I deal with on a daily basis. And so people tell me things like, the green transition has large short-term costs. Just because the green stuff is more expensive right now. It is not an investment opportunity in the sense that we're doing the same things, but just in a green way. I think you mentioned it in passant during your intervention yesterday. And so a car is a car, whether it is an EV or an internal combustion engine car, it does what a car does, which is drive your food. If the EV is more expensive, it is a cost. And so it should be seen as, something we have to do, because we have to do the green transition, but it is not an investment opportunity. It creates stranded assets. There's plenty of stuff that we have that is going to be stuck in terms of not being able to use it anymore. Our macro models, including our own definition, and a bunch of other models, don't show these growth impacts. And so they would say, on over a 10-year horizon, maybe it's plus 0.5 percentage points of GDP. Maybe it is a bit negative, but more or less it's neutral. When you look at jobs, maybe a little bit more positive, but in any case, very small component over a longer term period of time. Empirical studies as well show, even the positive ones show a small positive effect. Now, I take a bit of a different perspective, and the reason why I do this is, first, I think that a lot of the models we use are not appropriate. This is something that came up yesterday a bit in the definition of their baseline. And this is something we were discussing also yesterday at dinner time, in the sense that I don't care whether the green transition is productivity enhancing vis-a-vis business as usual scenario, because business as usual scenario is the only scenario we know doesn't exist. And so the scenario we have ahead of us, if things proceed as they are going, is a scenario in which all of these estimations of climate costs and GDP impacts. And that is the scenario we have ahead of us. And what we're trying to do with climate policies is to lift ourselves out of that negative scenario. And this is often not factored in because our climate models and our macro models are not entirely integrated. When you start doing this, you see that while lifting yourself out of a negative scenario, which is the new baseline or the rightly defined baseline, the switch side of avoiding costs is generating growth. And this is something, of course, also Jean-Stanley Ferry was mentioning in the 2020s and others. The second element, and again, it's something that I believe we were discussing on breakfast, which is that very often the way we're modeling the green transition is slapping carbon tax within the models we have. And that, of course, is very reductive. Insofar, what we're trying to do is much wider, much broader in terms of the policy instruments we're trying to use, and in terms of the outcomes we're going to generate. And so, in a way, there are a lot of components that are missing. You're not looking necessarily at the public investment perspective. Sometimes you are. The subsidies, the carbon border adjustment, all in synchronous and at a global level, effectively. And so if you were to do that, and and you realize that we're effectively trying to transform everything, agriculture, housing, transport, the way we're doing everything right now, in a way, it makes me question whether it's a bit of a Lucas critique with a green flavor, and so whether you can use a model of the economy to model the impact of a complete transformation of the economy. More broadly, the way I look at these things, writing more about the green transition, I've been venturing more into economic history, looking for parallels as to the scale of what we're trying to achieve. And to my mind, there are precedents of these radical, complete structural transformations of the economy, and this resembles something that looks a lot alike an industrial revolution. When we look at that example and what happened with that example, of course, what it did is that it was completely recasting comparative advantages across the border, across the globe. And so to a certain extent, even if, let's assume that at a global level, the productivity improvement is broadly neutral, or the job creation at global level is broadly neutral, that to my mind is not very interesting. And what is more interesting is trying to understand where job creation, job destruction is going to be, because these swings are huge. And so it's less interesting to look at the net, and it is more interesting to look at the flow. One point, this is a more modern slide with respect to my standard talk, because back to this recent paper that came out in August by Tim Besley and Dustin Persson. And what they're trying to do is indeed to say, look, preferences are shifting. And in a way, we are often, the way we've modeled this is to a large extent that preferences were fixed. And that in a way we're using prices and we're using carbon taxes and so on to push a consumer into doing something that they wouldn't otherwise because their preferences are what they are. And what they're trying to realize and model, actually, because I've been saying this, but they've been trying to integrate this in our standard modeling, is to say, well, actually, preferences are shifting and technology is adapting to that. And there is an interplay between the speed of the technology and the speed of preference shifting, and so you can create a virtuous circle. The reason why I'm interested in this, and I'm mentioning this in this presentation, is that, of course, if green preferences are improving and increasing, it means that firms that excel at green products initially will experience green profits, let's say, or greater profits by shifting to green production. Effectively generating growth or raising their profitability. Now, just a few final slides. When I present these things, I get a bunch of reactions of people telling me, yeah, but this has nothing to do with past energy transitions, because past energy transitions were efficiency improving and the new energy was cheaper, and so it doesn't compare. And I go back to the work of Roger Fouquet, for example, with some interesting papers on past energy transitions, and he shows exactly this, which is to say, look, the new energy option in most of these past energy transitions was not the cheapest early on. It became the cheapest because we invested in it, but early on you had the preference shifting mechanism, which is what Besley and Persson were doing. And because of that, richer households started to, let's say, adopt the new technology. Because they started to adopt the new technology, there were scale effects. At some point, you reached price parity. And when you reach price parity, this thing sort of spread across the board. And this is a bit the story of also how, for example, gas heat, there was a switch from coal to gas heating in London. You had an environmental shock with the Great Smog of London. This was sort of an awakening. The green option was seen as superior. Richer households intervened. Governments helped a bit. At some point, you had a regulation that said you can no longer use coal, and that was the end of the story. And to my mind, we're going to do something similar. There's another case study, let's say, coming from Václav Smil, which is an expert, obviously, of energy transitions or energy systems, and he looks at steamships, sail ships and steamships. And again, he's saying, look, the early steamships were not more efficient because you had to load on a lot of coal. you didn't have the charging points, the equivalent of our EVs now. You didn't have points to load to get your coal. The engine wasn't very efficient, so you were using a lot of space for the coal, very little for the product. And so in the end, early on, it was not efficient, and then the investment made it efficient. In general, there has been work looking at industrial revolutions, the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, saying, look, early on, these things were not the switch to cotton spinning machines was not the most efficient option early on because the factory didn't even exist. So you had to let's say, do secondary innovations that allowed to reap the benefits of it. During the second industrial revolution, same thing with electricity. Electricity on the surface of it, you're switching from one energy source to another. You're going from coal to electricity. So what's the big deal? But of course, the big deal is that you can switch to the assembly line and moving away from the line shaft, and this had huge productivity improvements, but you needed secondary innovation. So my question is, what is the scope for secondary innovation within the green transition that we're looking at? And it is my impression that very often we're looking at the green transition as something we need to reach, and once we've reached it, that's the end of history. It's like the technological end of history, which obviously it's not, and there's going to be continued innovation on this new green path. And actually, there are reasons to believe that the scope for secondary innovation is large within these new energy sources, even just because we have probably entered into diminishing marginal returns from previous energy sources. This is the book we're talking about. Thank you very much for your attention.